Hello, you're watching Outsiders with Rita Panahi, James Morrow, and myself, Rowan Dean. Well, calm down. John Howard is and will always remain, in my opinion, one of our greatest prime ministers. The Howard years, for all of us lucky enough to live through them, were truly the golden years. 11 years later, when most Australians were blithely saying, "Oh, Howard's been around too long, it's time for a new broom," I was telling anyone who would listen, basically our poodle and the guy in the local deli, that electing Kevin Rudd would be a monumental mistake and Australians would long live to regret turfing out John Howard. Even I could not have anticipated how accurate that prediction would be. Needless to say, after losing government and even his own seat, John Howard disappeared largely from view. I was extremely privileged when in 2013 he agreed to launch my first book, Beyond Satire, at a wonderful event where we joked about politicians and humour. Derided by the left during his entire prime ministership as a dullard and a bore, John Howard is in fact a great raconteur with a terrific wit and a razor-sharp mind. I have had the pleasure of his company on several occasions and am also full of admiration for Jeanette Howard. So what I'm about to say gives me no pleasure at all. John Howard has a new book out next week called A Sense of Balance. One of Mr. Howard's many talents is his gift with the pen. He's a terrific writer, so there is no question that the book will be a fantastic read. But the title, A Sense of Balance, 4 words that fill me with foreboding and dread, because in my opinion, balance in politics is the enemy of conviction. We don't cast our vote, well, I certainly don't, others may do, hoping to get a leader who takes into account everybody's point of view and then seeks the balance, the safe focus group approved middle ground. Oh, sorry, did I just describe Scott Morrison, Dominic Perrottet, Matthew Guy, Simon Birmingham and all the other bedwetters? My mistake. Yes, there are always moments when any leader must compromise and make concessions. But once you elevate the concept of a sense of balance and prioritise it, it becomes the filter to your decision-making. The common phrase used to justify compromise is, "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." Sure, but this formula simply leads to a downward spiral of compromise and half-baked measures and, by definition, imperfect policy. I would argue, for example, that the only times John Howard made bad decisions was when he blinked at the final hurdle. The GST is a prime example. Terrific reform. Amazing conviction to resurrect it from the grave, and an absolute boon to our economy. But that 11th hour decision to exclude certain categories like food was a mistake, making the tax unnecessarily complicated and far less effective. He should have stuck to his guns, but the GST still stands as a towering achievement. The bigger blunder, in my opinion, was Kyoto. In order to satisfy the lovies, rather than rejecting Kyoto outright, the Howard government committed to meeting Kyoto targets by, in essence, stealing farming land from Aussie farmers, potentially productive land that was sacrificed on the altar of carbon abatement. Stealing may be a bit strong, but the Liberals struck a deal with the Nats and the state governments to basically declare that large tracts of farming land could not be cleared in order to meet climate targets. Fine if you're an inner-city kale and spinach munching soy latte sipper, not so great if you're the farmer who has to clear your land to grow some kale, spinach or soy. All of which you can argue the toss on, and none of which diminishes my respect for Howard's formidable legacy. Overall, the Howard years were such a success because John Howard resisted the relentless attacks from the left, from the ABC, from all those who demonised him, ridiculed him and sneered at his every achievement. There was no sense of balance at the ABC or in any of the left-wing media as they waged a relentless and permanent and often highly personal war against John Howard's every move for 11 long years. But despite all of that, John Howard and Peter Costello, to their eternal credit, left us with a healthy economy in surplus, a sound work ethic, and a strong internal sense of Aussie common sense, decency and morality. Critically, John Howard had opened up a whole new constituency for the once posh and aloof Liberal Party. The Howard Battlers, those on Alan Jones's struggle street, everyday Aussies who once were die-hard Labor voters, who were now encouraged to aspire to create their own wealth, their own success, to buy and sell properties, to buy their own shares, to reach for the good life through their own hard yakka. The Aussie version, in fact, of Reagan's blue-collar Democrats and Thatcher's working-class council flat owners. There was, however, one monumental mistake that John Howard made, which cost this country dearly and cost the Liberal Party dearly. And that was, of course, his foolish embrace of Malcolm Turnbull. Not once, but twice. First, by inviting Turnbull into the party, and then by encouraging him to stick around post-2007. This was done, I can only assume, in order to bring a sense of balance to Howard's succession, a leftist counterweight to Tony Abbott. It was a disaster in every conceivable way, and the Liberal Party is still reeling from that poisonous legacy, with the likes of Matt Keane, Dave Sharma, Simon Birmingham, Andrew Bragg, and so many others, the mutant offsprings of that decision. Indeed, the flirtation with Turnbull exposed the one and only major flaw in Howard's political acumen. He can be a rather poor judge of character. So I suppose I shouldn't have been quite so dismayed as I was when I opened the Australian newspaper on Friday to read John Howard's scathing comments about Donald Trump. Namely, that he is appalling, atrocious, he is unfit to return to office, and he should never have run for office in 2016. Whoa! Hold your horses there, John. Now, everyone in the publishing game knows that the trick is to make sure you've got something really explosive in there to get some publicity, so fair enough. If John Howard has to trash Trump to sell a few extra copies, that's fine by me. But I don't think that's the motivation. I genuinely think that John Howard, much like many other Conservatives I deeply respect and admire, such as Greg Sheridan, has a real blind spot when it comes to Donald Trump. By my amateur diagnosis, both Howard and Sheridan, otherwise healthy of mind and soul, suffer from the dreaded illness of acute Trump derangement syndrome. Only this week, Greg Sheridan was on the Bolt Report, also trashing Donald Trump.
As someone who always lives on the edge of illegality in his, business dealings and in his political dealings, he's a bit like the Chinese Communist Party. He's brilliant at that grey zone, flirting right on the edge of illegality. The only time I ever feel any sympathy for Trump is when I hear his enemies in the Democratic Party and CNN rabbit on about him. Trump is really a despicable person who will kill the Republican Party.
Whoa, despicable. Sheridan, whom I do regard as one of our greatest political commentators, has an excellent and perceptive article in yesterday's Weekend Australian. Headlined accurately, "The Liberals have lost the plot amid a global crisis on the right." Sheridan's analysis is spot on until he hits the Trump pothole and fails to recognise that all the things Sheridan suggests Conservatives need to do, such as court minority votes, are precisely what Donald Trump did and will do again. Also worth reading is Terry Barnes's excellent piece in The Spectator Australia online about how the Liberals are, well, rooted. He used a stronger word than that, but as his more responsible editor, I toned it down. Terry forensically goes through the Liberal Party state by state and federally to justify this depressing conclusion. But back to John Howard saying Trump is unfit for office. That's a big call. And there is no doubt that coming from John Howard, hugely respected among American conservatives, it will come as a bitter blow to many. Adjectives like appalling and disgraceful litter Troy Bramston's interviews with Mr. Howard. In a follow-up article, Troy goes into John Howard's new book in more detail, detailing, for instance, John Howard's disappointment with the Morrison government and its lack of any serious economic reform. Quote, "The absence of a program for the future, the absence of some kind of manifesto hurt us very badly," John Howard says about the last election. Indeed, and as we kept saying here, week in, week out on this show in the run-up to the election. John Howard makes several other criticisms of Scott Morrison, including labelling Morrison's attack on Christine Holgate as egregious, pointing out she had done nothing wrong. Again, as we said here many times. There's also long overdue criticism, finally, of the appalling Malcolm Turnbull. Quote, "The thing about removing Abbott was that he had done the really difficult thing. He had got the party back into power," says John Howard, 8 years too late. John Howard also criticises, quite rightly, Matt Keane for attacking the outstanding candidate for Warringah, Catherine Deeves, in the run-up to the federal election. Personally, I believe Deeves could have won that seat were it not for Morrison's cowardly decision to cancel his own candidate. And I was extremely impressed with John Howard when he went out on the hustings to show his support for Catherine Deeves. Well done, John. But back to Howard's criticisms of Donald Trump, claiming he's unfit for office. Firstly, Howard criticises Trump's personality. Quote, he lacked public grace. Yeah, OK, well, I'm sorry. Judge Trump on what he did for his country. The lowest record employment for African Americans, Hispanics and women. The only president with no wars to his name. Building a wall to seal the southern border. Yes, many of Donald Trump's ideas were, like the man himself, shocking, previously unthinkable, brash. Pull out of Paris. Open up fracking and become energy independent. Forget about the Palestinians and make peace between Israel and her sunny Arab neighbours with the Abraham Accords. Ditch Obama's insane nuclear deal with Iran. Challenge China. Bring manufacturing back to the USA. Restore national pride. Bring North Korea in from the cold to keep her under control. Threaten to nuke Putin if he dares to invade Ukraine. Put him in his box. Stick to your guns on foreign policy. I could go on and on. But Mr. Howard dismisses all of that because Trump, the man, is graceless? Seriously? If you're a struggling black woman who's finally got a job, the president's lack of grace is of little interest. I would argue that Trump's appeal to the working classes and minorities of America and all he did for them is in fact just the latest incarnation of Howard's appeal to the Howard battlers and of Abbott's appeal to Tony's tradies. Mr. Howard then claims Trump's behaviour since losing the election has been disgraceful. This appears to be the nub of the matter. John Howard insists election results should be respected and, cricket fan that he is, the umpire's decision is final. Fair enough. Absolutely no disagreement there. But I would ask John Howard this. Were he to now learn that in 2007, a left-leaning tech billionaire had covertly spent nearly $500 million in unaccountable cash to fortify the vote for Kevin 07, would he not be slightly curious as to how and where that cash was spent? Were John to see a videotape of, say, dozens of individuals driving around collecting absentee ballot forms from old people's homes in Bennelong and stuffing hundreds of unmarked ballot papers into ballot boxes in the dead of night in Liberal electorates that were then won by Labor against all predictions, would he not be slightly curious as to what they were doing and whether those votes were legitimate? Would he not raise at least one of his famous bushy eyebrows? We only get one vote and we only get it once every few years. It is crucial to any democracy that the public has complete and utter faith that every vote is fair and every vote fairly counted. Otherwise, what's the point? If one vote can be falsified, hundreds can, and if hundreds can, thousands can. And at that point, we are all disenfranchised and the wealthy and the corrupt rule with impunity. As an aside, there are legitimate questions about the security of our own electoral system, the lack of IDs, and the glaring potential for voter fraud that neither side of politics in this country has shown any interest in addressing. In the USA, there is no question that thanks to the COVID era, numerous Democrat states were able to change fundamental aspects of the voting laws to arguably increase the opportunity for voter fraud. Some Democrat states are now trying to entrench those changes, whereas some Republican states are now trying to prevent those changes from occurring again. It is not good enough to say, oh, who cares about a few dodgy votes? They can't swing an election. Nobody gives us any wiggle room on paying our taxes, on driving at the speed limit, on paying our debts, or on so many other things that are fundamental to our everyday lives. An election is either fair or unfair. We may never know what happened in the 2020 election, but as John Hinderaker said here on Outsiders the following morning, Biden and the Democrats may not have stolen the election, but it wasn't for lack of trying. Sheridan and Barnes are correct that the Liberal Party is now in dire straits. In my opinion, Peter Dutton is the hope of the side, but only if he sticks to his guns and ignores the bedwetters. That means avoiding I'm sorry, avoiding a sense of balance and sticking doggedly to fundamental conservative principles. The legacy of Turnbull still poisons the Liberal water table. John Howard's formidable talents would be better spent criticising those who keep dragging his party to the left, rather than trashing the reputation of the one US president who actually managed to drag America back to the right. And in my opinion, will do so again.